Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight we journey into the ancient and untamed heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a land older than most life on Earth and steeped in mysteries that stretch back centuries. The stories you are about to hear are not just tales whispered around a campfire. They are real accounts from hikers, hunters, and lifelong mountain residents who have each encountered something in these vast, brooding forests that defies explanation. We have gathered accounts from across the spine of Appalachia, stories of shadowy figures in forgotten hollows, inexplicable disappearances, and strange lights that have left even the most skeptical witnesses bewildered. These 10 encounters are as authentic as the mountains themselves, with details coming directly from those who walked away forever changed. If you are passionate about true, hair-raising horror, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for nightly journeys into the unknown. And do not forget to ring the notification bell so you are the first to know when darkness descends again. Now, steel your nerves and join me as we venture into the depths of the Appalachian Mountains, where the line between legend and reality blurs, and no one knows what truly awaits beyond the last trail marker. After 15 years as a Shenandoah National Park ranger, I thought I had seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Black bears wandering through campsites, hikers lost for days in the fog, even the occasional marijuana grow operation hidden deep in the backcountry. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I have walked every major trail in this park, from the popular tourist routes to the forgotten paths that only appear on maps from the 1940s. I knew the sounds of these woods like a symphony, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of barred owls, the crack of branches under deer hooves. But in October of 2018, I encountered something in these ancient mountains that made me question everything I thought I knew about the wilderness I had dedicated my life to protecting. The incident began on a Tuesday morning when I received a radio call from dispatch about a missing hiker. Sarah Melbourne, a 34-year-old photographer from Richmond, had failed to check out of her campsite at Big Meadows, and her rental car was still in the parking lot 3 days past her planned departure. Her sister had called the Park Service after Sarah stopped responding to text messages, which was unusual for someone who typically stayed in contact during solo trips. I grabbed my gear and headed to her last known location, expecting another routine search and recovery operation. Sarah had registered for a backcountry camping permit to photograph fall foliage along the Appalachian Trail between Skyland and Thornton Gap. It was a popular section during peak autumn, but the weather had been unusually cold that week, driving most casual hikers to lower elevations. I started my search at her abandoned campsite, which showed signs of hasty departure. Her tent was still standing, but the rainfly was twisted and one of the stakes had been pulled from the ground. Inside, I found her sleeping bag bunched up in the corner and personal items scattered across the floor. Her expensive camera equipment was missing, but her wallet and car keys remained untouched. The trail leading away from her campsite told a story that made my stomach tighten with unease. Sarah's boot prints were clearly visible in the soft earth, but alongside them were impressions I could not immediately identify. They were larger than human feet, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips, pressed deep into the mud as if made by something considerably heavier than a person. The tracks followed the official trail for about half a mile before veering sharply into dense undergrowth toward a section of forest I rarely patrolled. I radioed for backup and continued following the trail of disturbed vegetation and broken branches. The temperature seemed to drop as I moved deeper into the woods, and the usual forest sounds grew muted and distant. After 2 hours of careful tracking, I found Sarah's camera bag hanging from a branch 15 feet above the ground. The strap had been cleanly severed, and the expensive equipment inside was destroyed. Not damaged by a fall, but systematically crushed, as if something had deliberately rendered it useless. The discovery that truly unsettled me came another 100 yards deeper into the forest. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree were symbols I had never seen before, geometric patterns that seemed almost hieroglyphic in their complexity. The cuts were fresh, made within the last few days, and far too precise to be the work of vandals with pocket knives. Each symbol was approximately 6 inches tall and carved to a uniform depth that would have required considerable time and specialized tools. More disturbing was the pattern of dark stains around the base of the tree that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I was photographing the symbols when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I had encountered in 15 years of mountain work. It started as a low humming, almost musical, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. The tone was too consistent and sustained to be produced by wind through the trees, and too deep to come from any bird or small animal I knew. As I listened, the humming gradually transformed into what sounded almost like whispering, though I could not make out any actual words. The sound seemed to move through the forest, circling my position, at a distance I estimated to be about 50 yards. Every instinct developed through years of wilderness experience told me to retreat, but my responsibility to find Sarah kept me moving forward. The whispering grew louder as I approached a small clearing where the canopy opened enough to let in patches of afternoon sunlight. In the center of this space, I found evidence that someone had been camping, not in any conventional sense, but living rough in a way that suggested either severe mental illness or something far worse. A crude shelter had been constructed from branches and forest debris, barely large enough for a person to crawl inside. Scattered around this primitive structure were items that clearly belonged to Sarah: her hiking boots, pieces of torn clothing, and a water bottle with her name written in permanent marker. But mixed among her possessions were objects that made no sense. Animal bones arranged in careful patterns, more of those strange symbols carved into flat pieces of bark, and what appeared to be a journal written in a script I could not read. The journal was bound in what looked like leather, though the texture was unlike any animal hide I recognized. The pages were filled with dense writing in black ink, accompanied by detailed sketches of the surrounding forest. Some drawings showed the trees and landscape with photographic accuracy, while others depicted human figures in various states of distress. One page contained what was unmistakably a portrait of Sarah, drawn with enough skill to be recognizable, but with an expression of terror that made me hope it was purely artistic interpretation. As I examined the journal, the whispering sound returned, much closer this time. I could hear movement in the undergrowth around the clearing, but despite my years of tracking experience, I could not pinpoint the source. Whatever was making the noise moved with a deliberate stealth that suggested intelligence and familiarity with the terrain. I drew my service weapon and called out, identifying myself as a park ranger and demanding that whoever was there show themselves. The response was not what I expected. Instead of emerging from hiding or fleeing deeper into the forest, the presence began to circle the clearing more rapidly. I could hear branches breaking and leaves rustling as something large moved through the trees, maintaining a consistent distance, but clearly observing my every movement. The whispering became more agitated, rising in pitch and taking on an almost conversational quality, as if multiple voices were discussing my presence in a language I did not understand. I activated my emergency radio beacon and began backing toward what I hoped was the direction I had come from. The circling movement followed me, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was tracking me possessed an intimate knowledge of the forest that far exceeded my own. Every time I thought I had identified a clear path back to the main trail, the sounds would intensify from that direction, forcing me to change course. It was as if I was being herded deeper into the wilderness by something that understood these mountains better than any human possibly could. The psychological pressure of being stalked by an unseen presence while responsible for finding a missing person created a stress unlike anything from my ranger training. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every natural forest sound, and second-guessing decisions that should have been automatic after years of backcountry experience. The whispering followed me for over an hour, sometimes fading to barely audible levels, before returning with renewed intensity whenever I stopped to check my compass or radio. Just as the sun began to set, and I was starting to panic about spending the night in the forest under these circumstances, I heard the blessed sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. The search and rescue team had received my beacon signal and was conducting an aerial sweep of the area. The moment the helicopter became visible through the canopy, the whispering stopped abruptly, and the sense of being watched lifted like a physical weight being removed from my shoulders. The helicopter crew lowered a rescue basket, and I had never been so grateful to leave solid ground behind. As we lifted above the treetops, I directed the pilot to circle the area where I had found Sarah's belongings. From the air, the forest looked completely normal, just another section of Appalachian woodland showing its autumn colors. There was no sign of the crude shelter, no evidence of the disturbed vegetation I had followed, and no trace of whatever had been stalking me through the trees. Sarah Melbourne was never found. The official report listed her as missing and presumed dead, another tragic statistic in the long history of people who simply vanished in the Appalachian wilderness. The items I had discovered were cataloged as evidence, though the journal disappeared from the evidence room before it could be properly analyzed. My supervisor suggested that the stress of the search had caused me to misinterpret normal forest sounds and shadows, a conclusion I might have accepted if not for one final detail. 3 days after the search was called off, I returned to my truck in the ranger station parking lot to find something that confirmed my worst fears about what had happened to Sarah. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a photograph, one of Sarah's professional nature shots, but modified in a way that made my blood run cold. Someone had used red ink to draw those same strange symbols across the image, and written in the margin was a message in the same script I had seen in the mysterious journal. "She walks with us now." I submitted my resignation the following week and moved to a desk job with the National Forest Service in Colorado. I still work in wilderness management, but I have never again volunteered for search and rescue operations in areas where the trees are old enough to remember things that happened before humans walked these mountains. The Appalachians have been here for 480 million years, and I'm now convinced that some places in those ancient hills are still inhabited by presences that consider humans to be intruders in their domain. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the pines outside my Colorado home, I still hear echoes of that whispering from the Shenandoah forest. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I wonder if Sarah Melbourne really is still walking somewhere in those dark hollows, adding her voice to whatever calls from the shadows between the trees. In spring break 2019, me and my roommates decided to skip Panama City and try something different, a hiking trip through Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I am Rebecca Thompson, though everyone calls me Becca, and I was a junior at East Carolina University studying environmental science. My 3 roommates were equally inexperienced with serious hiking, but we were all tired of the same beach party routine and wanted an adventure that did not involve overpriced drinks and sunburn. We packed our borrowed gear into my Honda Civic and drove west toward the Tennessee-North Carolina border, armed with nothing but enthusiasm and a trail map we had printed from the park website. We started our trip at the Elkmont campground, planning to hike the Little River Trail to Cucumber Gap and back over 3 days. It was supposed to be an easy route, well-marked and heavily traveled, perfect for college students who had more confidence than experience. The first day went exactly as planned. We hiked 4 miles through beautiful forest, took dozens of selfies with the spring wildflowers, and set up camp at a designated backcountry site beside a creek. The weather was perfect, the trail was clearly marked, and we felt like we had discovered the secret to the perfect college vacation. My roommate Jessica had brought a portable speaker, and we spent the evening playing music and telling stories around our campfire. Megan documented everything for Instagram, while Ashley practiced her nature photography with the expensive camera her parents had given her for Christmas. We were having the exact kind of bonding experience we had hoped for, and I fell asleep that night feeling like we had made the right choice in trading spring break beaches for mountain trails. The second morning started normally enough. We broke camp after a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, packed our gear, and started hiking deeper into the mountains. The trail was well maintained and easy to follow, marked with the familiar white blazes that indicated we were still on the official Park Service route. We made good time through the morning, stopping frequently to take pictures and enjoy the scenery. By noon, we had covered about 6 miles and were feeling confident about reaching our planned campsite by mid-afternoon. That confidence began to evaporate when we reached what should have been a major trail junction marked on our map. According to our planning, we should have encountered the intersection with the Cucumber Gap Trail around mile marker 7. But when we reached the spot where the junction should have been, we found nothing but a continuation of the same trail we had been following. There was no side trail, no trail signs, and no indication that any other route had ever existed in this location. Jessica suggested we had miscalculated our distance and kept walking, assuming the junction was still ahead. But after another hour of hiking, we still had not found the intersection that was clearly marked on our printed map. More concerning was the fact that the trail itself was beginning to look different. The well-maintained path with its regular blazes was gradually becoming narrower and less defined. The white paint marks that had been appearing every 50 yards were now spaced much farther apart, and some looked faded, as if they had not been refreshed in years. Ashley was the first to voice what we were all thinking, that we might have somehow taken a wrong turn without realizing it. But that seemed impossible, given that we had been following a single trail with no branches or alternate routes. We stopped to consult our map and GPS, only to discover that my phone was showing our location as somewhere completely off the marked trail system. According to the GPS, we were in an area designated as wilderness, where no official trails existed. The realization that we were lost hit us with varying degrees of panic. Jessica wanted to immediately turn around and retrace our steps, while Megan insisted we should keep going forward since we had to eventually reach some kind of landmark or road. Ashley began taking pictures obsessively, as if documenting our situation would somehow help solve it. I tried to remain calm and logical, but internally I was fighting a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with being temporarily lost. Something about the forest around us felt fundamentally wrong in a way I could not articulate. The trees seemed older and more twisted than they had appeared that morning, with thick moss covering their trunks in patterns that looked almost deliberate. The undergrowth was denser, creating shadows that seemed to shift and move when I was not looking directly at them. Most unsettling was the absolute silence. No bird songs, no insect noise, not even the sound of wind moving through the branches above us. We decided to retrace our steps, but after hiking back for what felt like hours, we could not find our previous night's campsite or any of the landmarks we remembered passing. The trail behind us looked completely unfamiliar, as if we had never walked it before. The blazes that should have guided us back were either missing entirely or painted in colors we did not recognize, faded yellow marks, and strange blue symbols that definitely had not been there during our morning hike. By late afternoon, we were forced to admit that we were thoroughly lost in a section of forest that bore no resemblance to the park maps we carried. The trail we were following had become little more than a deer path, winding between massive trees that blocked most of the sunlight. Our water was running low, our phones had no signal, and the temperature was beginning to drop as evening approached. Most terrifying was the growing certainty that we were no longer in the same forest we had started hiking in that morning. As darkness fell, we had no choice but to make camp wherever we were. We found a small clearing beside what might have been a stream, though the water was too dark to see clearly and made sounds unlike any running water I had ever heard. The noise was more like whispering or soft conversation, as if the water itself was trying to communicate something we could not understand. We set up our tents in a tight cluster, built a small fire, and tried to convince ourselves that everything would make more sense in the morning light. Sleep was impossible. The forest around our camp was alive with sounds that had no natural explanation. Footsteps that circled our campsite at irregular intervals. Voices calling from different directions in languages none of us recognized. And music that seemed to drift through the trees from some impossible distance. Jessica swore she could hear children singing, while Ashley insisted the sounds were just wind and animal calls distorted by her anxiety. But I heard them too. Human voices speaking words I could not understand, getting closer as the night progressed. The most disturbing incident occurred around 3 in the morning, when Megan shook me awake and pointed toward the edge of our firelight. Standing just beyond the circle of illumination were 3 figures that looked like people, but wrong in ways that made my eyes refuse to focus on them properly. They were tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed to be made from forest materials, bark and leaves and moss woven together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could see their eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's. The figures stood motionless for several minutes, apparently watching us, before slowly backing into the darkness between the trees. None of us spoke about what we had seen until morning, each hoping that the others had been asleep, and that the whole encounter had been a stress-induced hallucination. But when daylight came, we found footprints around our campsite. Barefoot impressions that were too long and narrow to have been made by any human, pressed into the earth with a weight that suggested something much heavier than a person. We broke camp as quickly as possible and continued following what remained of the trail, desperate to find some sign of civilization, or at least a recognizable landmark. The path led us through sections of forest that seemed to change character every few hundred yards. From dense pine groves to open meadows filled with flowers that bloomed in colors I had never seen before, to rocky areas where the stone formations looked like ruins of ancient buildings. Around midday, we crested a ridge and saw something that made us all stop and stare in disbelief. Spread out in the valley below was a small town that definitely had not been marked on any of our maps. The buildings looked old-fashioned, like something from a historical photograph, with wooden structures and dirt streets that belonged to another century entirely. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and we could see people moving around between the buildings, going about what appeared to be normal daily activities. We practically ran down the hillside toward the town, convinced that our ordeal was finally over. But as we got closer, details began to emerge that made us slow our approach. The people we had seen from a distance were dressed in clothing from what looked like the 1800s, long dresses and suspenders, and hats that no one wore anymore. More disturbing was their behavior. They moved with a strange, synchronized quality, as if they were all following the same unheard rhythm or responding to the same unspoken commands. When we were about 100 yards from the nearest building, one of the townspeople looked up and saw us. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. Every person in sight stopped what they were doing and turned to stare in our direction, with expressions of such malevolent intent that we instinctively backed away. Then, as if responding to a signal none of us could hear, they began walking toward us in perfect unison, their faces blank, but their eyes filled with an intelligence that was definitely not human. We ran. We turned around and sprinted back up the hillside as fast as our legs could carry us, not stopping until we reached the ridgeline and could no longer see the impossible town below. When we finally caught our breath and looked back, the valley was empty. No buildings, no people, just normal forest stretching toward the horizon as if nothing had ever been there. The trail we found on the other side of the ridge was different again, newer looking and clearly marked with fresh white blazes. Within 2 hours, we encountered other hikers for the first time since our ordeal began, and by evening, we had reached a ranger station where we learned that we had somehow emerged on the opposite side of the park from where we had started. According to the rangers, we had covered nearly 40 miles in terrain that should have been impossible to traverse in the time we had been missing. The official explanation was that we had become disoriented and taken several wrong turns, eventually finding our way back to marked trails through luck and persistence. Our phones showed that we had been hiking for exactly the amount of time we remembered, with no missing hours or unexplained gaps. But none of us ever spoke about the town we had seen or the figures who had watched us sleep, and we all agreed never to go hiking in the Appalachian Mountains again. Sometimes I still wake up at night thinking I can hear that strange whispering water and those children's voices singing songs in languages that predate human speech. And sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas and see small towns nestled in mountain valleys, I find myself wondering if they are really there, or if I am seeing another glimpse of whatever parallel world we stumbled into during those 3 days when the familiar trail led us somewhere that does not exist on any map. Been guiding hunters through West Virginia backcountry for 30 years, know these ridges like the back of my hand, which is why what I found up on Backbone Mountain still keeps me awake at night. Name is James O'Sullivan, though everybody calls me Jimmy, and I have been taking city folks after deer and turkey since I got back from Desert Storm in 1991. My family has lived in these mountains for 5 generations, and there is not a hollow or creek bed within 50 miles that I have not walked at least once. I know every old logging road, every abandoned homestead, every cave and cliff face that dots this ancient landscape. That intimate knowledge of the terrain is exactly what made the discovery so deeply unsettling. October 2017, I was guiding a father and son from Pittsburgh on their first serious hunting trip. The Kowalskis had booked a 5-day package through my outfitting service, wanting to experience what they called authentic Appalachian hunting culture. They were decent enough people, though soft in the way that city folks tend to be, and they listened to my instructions about safety and woodcraft with the kind of earnest attention that told me they were taking the whole experience seriously. We had set up a base camp about 8 miles back from the nearest Forest Service road, in an area where I had been successfully taking clients for over a decade. The third morning of their hunt started before dawn, as usual. We were tracking a good-sized buck that had been leaving sign near a creek about 2 miles north of our camp. The father, Stan, was a decent shot, but loud in the woods, while his son Danny had better natural instincts for moving quietly through the brush. We had been following fresh tracks for about an hour when I realized we were moving through terrain that looked unfamiliar, despite the fact that I was certain we were still within the hunting territory I knew by heart. The trees were older than they should have been in this particular section of forest. I remembered this area being dominated by second-growth timber, the result of logging operations from the 1970s. But the oaks and maples towering above us were clearly much older, massive trunks that would have taken over a century to reach their current size. More puzzling was the complete absence of any logging roads or stumps that should have marked where the original forest had been harvested decades earlier. I stopped the group and checked my GPS unit, which showed our location as approximately where I expected it to be. But the landscape around us did not match my memory of this particular section of Backbone Mountain. The ridge lines were steeper, the hollows deeper, and the rock formations more pronounced than they should have been. Most concerning was a faint trail that I had never seen before, winding up the hillside toward what appeared to be a structure partially hidden among the trees above us. Danny spotted it first, a flash of weathered wood and rusted metal through the branches about 200 yards uphill from our position. We approached cautiously, not sure if we were looking at an abandoned building or someone's hunting cabin that we might be trespassing on. As we got closer, details emerged that made me increasingly uncomfortable with what we had stumbled across. The structure was definitely a cabin, but built in a style I had never encountered in 3 decades of roaming these mountains. It was larger than most hunting shacks, with a steep metal roof and walls constructed from logs that had been fitted together with a precision that suggested considerable skill and time investment. But the craftsmanship was wrong in ways I could not immediately identify. Joints cut too precisely, wood aged in patterns that did not match natural weathering, and architectural details that seemed to belong to a much earlier era than the materials should have allowed. More disturbing was the cabin's location. It sat in a clearing that felt artificial, as if the surrounding forest had been carefully arranged rather than naturally grown. The trees formed an almost perfect circle around the structure, with their branches reaching inward in a way that created a canopy overhead while leaving the cabin itself in perpetual shadow. The ground around the building was bare earth, packed hard as concrete, with no grass or undergrowth, despite the rich forest soil that should have supported abundant plant life. Stan wanted to investigate further, driven by the kind of curiosity that city folks have about anything that seems authentically rustic. But my mountain instincts were screaming warnings that I had learned to trust over decades of wilderness experience. Something about the cabin felt deeply wrong, not just abandoned, but actively malevolent in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. I told the Kowalskis we should leave the area immediately, but Danny was already approaching the structure with his camera out. The front door was standing open, revealing an interior that was dark despite the morning sunlight filtering through the surrounding trees. Danny called out a greeting, following proper etiquette for approaching what might be someone's hunting camp, but received no response except an echo that sounded strangely distorted. As he got closer to the doorway, I could see inside well enough to make out details that convinced me we needed to leave immediately. The cabin's interior was furnished, but with items that belonged to no era I could identify. There were hand-carved chairs arranged around a table that looked medieval in its construction, oil lamps that appeared to be functional but ancient in design, and shelves lined with jars containing preserved items I did not want to examine too closely. Most unsettling was the presence of recent signs of habitation: a fire in the stone fireplace that was still smoldering, food on the table that looked freshly prepared, and clothing hanging on pegs that suggested someone lived there regularly. But it was the walls that finally convinced me we had stumbled into something beyond my experience with abandoned mountain cabins. Every vertical surface was covered with carved symbols similar to what I had heard described by other guides who claimed to have encountered evidence of old-time mountain magic. The symbols were arranged in complex patterns that seemed to shift and change when I was not looking directly at them, creating an optical illusion that made my eyes water and my head ache. Danny had stepped just inside the doorway when we heard it. A sound from the back of the cabin that was unmistakably human, but wrong in every other way. It started as a low humming, almost musical, that gradually transformed into what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. The words were in no language I recognized, but the tone conveyed a clear message of territorial anger and warning. Whatever lived in that cabin knew we were there and did not welcome our presence. I grabbed Danny by the shoulder and pulled him away from the doorway just as something moved in the shadows at the back of the cabin. I could not see clearly what it was, but the shape was wrong for a person. Too tall, too angular, moving in ways that suggested joints that bent in directions human anatomy does not allow. The humming grew louder and more agitated, joined by other sounds that seemed to come from beneath the cabin's floorboards. We retreated quickly, but not before Stan had taken several photographs of the cabin's exterior with his digital camera. As we backed down the hillside, I kept my rifle ready and watched for any sign that whatever inhabited the structure was following us. The humming continued for several minutes after we left the clearing, gradually fading into the normal sounds of the forest. But I could feel eyes watching our retreat, and I knew with absolute certainty that we had been allowed to leave rather than escaping through our own efforts. The hike back to our base camp took much longer than it should have, as I found myself completely disoriented in terrain I had thought I knew perfectly. Landmarks that should have been familiar were either missing entirely or positioned incorrectly relative to our route. We eventually reached our tents, but only after taking several wrong turns and backtracking multiple times through areas that I could have sworn I had never seen before. That evening, Stan reviewed the photographs he had taken of the mysterious cabin, and what we saw on his camera's display screen made all three of us question our sanity. The images showed nothing but normal forest, trees, and undergrowth with no sign of any structure or clearing. Even more disturbing, the GPS coordinates embedded in the photograph files placed them in a location several miles from where we had encountered the cabin, in an area I knew to be steep rocky terrain unsuitable for any kind of construction. I convinced the Kowalskis to cut their hunting trip short the next morning, citing concerns about changing weather conditions. They were disappointed, but trusted my judgment enough not to argue. As we packed our gear and prepared to hike out to the Forest Service road, I took one last look through my binoculars toward the ridge where we had found the cabin. Through the lenses, I could see smoke rising from the trees in approximately the right location, confirming that whatever we had encountered was still there. The drive back to civilization was mostly silent, each of us processing what had happened in our own way. Stan eventually convinced himself that we had simply gotten confused and disoriented in unfamiliar terrain, while Danny remained convinced that we had discovered something genuinely supernatural. I did not offer any theories, but I knew that my 30 years of mountain experience had not prepared me for whatever existed in that clearing on Backbone Mountain. I have never guided clients into that particular section of forest again, always finding reasons to hunt in other areas when requests come in for that general location. Other local guides have reported similar encounters over the years, glimpses of structures that should not exist, inhabited by presences that clearly predate modern settlement of these mountains. The old-timers in the community speak quietly about places where the mountains themselves are still wild in ways that go beyond simple wilderness, areas where something from before recorded history continues to make its home. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the forest and the light is failing, I catch myself listening for that strange humming sound and scanning the tree line for signs of smoke rising from impossible clearings. The mountains have been here for millions of years, and I am now certain that some hollows and ridges still harbor secrets that were ancient when the first Europeans arrived in these valleys. Whatever lives in that cabin on Backbone Mountain has been there much longer than my family has called these hills home, and it will still be there long after the last human hunter has walked these trails for the final time. I am Dr. Patricia Williams, a geologist who has spent most of my career exploring the hidden geological wonders of the eastern United States. In the summer of 2016, I joined a United States Geological Survey team assigned to study the unique limestone formations in eastern Kentucky's Daniel Boone National Forest. The forest is famous for its sprawling cave systems and karst topography, but what we discovered 200 feet underground was something that no geological training could have prepared me for. Our expedition was supposed to be routine scientific research. The USGS had assigned our team to conduct a comprehensive survey of the Ravens Hollow cave system, mapping previously unexplored passages and collecting water samples from the underground streams that carve these ancient limestone chambers. We were a small team of 5 specialists, myself as the lead geologist, Dr. Marcus Chen as our hydrologist, Sarah Kim handling photographic documentation, and 2 experienced cave guides from the local area who knew the entrance locations and safety protocols. The cave system we entered that Tuesday morning was known locally as Ravens Hollow, though it appeared on no official geological surveys. The local guides, brothers named Jake and Tom Morrison, had discovered the entrance during a hunting trip several years earlier, but had never ventured more than a few hundred feet into the system. They described hearing strange acoustics from deep within the cave, sounds that echoed in ways that defied their understanding of how sound should behave in underground spaces. The entrance was a narrow vertical shaft hidden behind a curtain of thick mountain laurel, descending approximately 30 feet before opening into a horizontal passage. We rappelled down with full scientific equipment: spectrometers, water testing kits, digital mapping tools, and enough rope and climbing gear to safely explore whatever passages we might discover. The initial descent was routine, with cool, humid air rising from below carrying the familiar scent of wet limestone and organic decay. The horizontal passage led us through a series of chambers, connected by narrow crawlways that required us to remove our packs and push them ahead of us through spaces barely wide enough for a human body. This type of cave architecture was typical for the region, carved by millennia of underground water flow through soluble bedrock. What was unusual was the complete absence of any cave formations, no stalactites, no flowstone deposits, no mineral crusts that typically accumulate in limestone caves over geological time. After 3 hours of steady progress deeper into the system, we reached a chamber unlike anything in my 20 years of cave exploration. The space was enormous. Our powerful LED lights could not reach the far walls or ceiling, and our voices echoed with a resonance that suggested a cathedral-sized cavern. An underground river flowed through the center of the chamber, its dark waters moving with surprising speed and creating a constant rushing sound that masked more subtle acoustic details. We established our base station near the river's edge and began the methodical process of scientific documentation. Dr. Chen collected water samples, while I measured the chamber's dimensions using laser range-finding equipment. Sarah documented everything with her camera system, and the Morrison brothers explored the chamber's perimeter, looking for additional passages or notable geological features. The work was routine and absorbing, the kind of detailed field research that forms the backbone of geological science. That routine was interrupted when Jake Morrison called out from somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights. He had discovered something carved into the chamber wall, symbols that appeared to be artificial rather than natural formations. We gathered around his location and illuminated a section of wall covered with intricate markings that had been precisely cut into the limestone surface. The symbols were unlike anything from known Native American petroglyphs or historical graffiti. They formed complex geometric patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles I could not immediately identify. More disturbing than the symbols themselves was their apparent age. The limestone surface showed signs of natural weathering and mineral deposition that would require centuries to develop, yet the carved lines remained sharp and clearly defined. From a geological perspective, this suggested the symbols had been created and then somehow protected from the normal processes of cave formation and erosion, a phenomenon I had never encountered in natural cave environments. As I was photographing the symbol wall for later analysis, we began to hear sounds from deeper within the chamber that had nothing to do with the flowing river. The noises started as barely audible vibrations felt more than heard, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the bedrock itself. Gradually, the vibrations became recognizable as sound, a rhythmic pulsing like the beating of an enormous heart, accompanied by what could only be described as voices chanting in unison. The chanting was unlike any human vocalization I had ever heard. The sounds were too deep, too resonant, and too perfectly synchronized to be produced by human voices. Yet the rhythm and tonal variations clearly indicated some form of communication or ceremonial practice. The voices seemed to be speaking in a language that predated any known human settlement of the region, using sounds that required vocal structures different from human anatomy. Our scientific instruments began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. Digital equipment that had been functioning perfectly suddenly displayed error messages or shut down entirely. Our GPS units lost signal despite being designed to work in underground environments, and radio communication with the surface became impossible. Most unsettling was the behavior of our acoustic measurement tools, which registered sound frequencies both above and below the range of human hearing, suggesting that whatever we were experiencing operated across a broader spectrum than our senses could detect. Dr. Chen was the first to notice the physical effects. He complained of a severe headache and difficulty concentrating, symptoms that quickly spread to other team members. The air itself seemed to become thicker and more oppressive, making breathing labored despite normal oxygen levels. Sarah's camera equipment began producing images with strange distortions, geometric patterns that appeared in the photographs but were not visible to the naked eye when looking at the same locations. The chanting grew louder and more complex, evolving from simple, rhythmic sounds into what could only be described as a conversation between multiple entities. The voices responded to each other with the give and take pattern of intelligent communication, though the content remained completely comprehensible. More disturbing was our growing certainty that the conversation was about us, that whatever intelligence produced these sounds was aware of our presence and discussing our intrusion into their domain. Tom Morrison was standing near the symbol wall when the limestone began to emit a faint phosphorescent glow. The carved patterns illuminated from within, pulsing in rhythm with the chanting voices and creating shifting shadows that made the chamber walls appear to move. The light was cold and blue, unlike any natural phosphorescence, and it revealed additional symbols carved higher on the walls that had been invisible under our artificial lighting. The climax came when Dr. Chen, driven by scientific curiosity despite his obvious discomfort, approached the glowing wall and reached out to touch one of the illuminated symbols. The moment his finger made contact with the carved limestone, the entire chamber erupted into chaos. The underground river surged upward, as if something massive had disturbed it from below, sending spray and foam cascading across the chamber floor. The chanting voices rose to a deafening crescendo before abruptly cutting off, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like physical pressure against our eardrums. In that moment of absolute quiet, we heard something that sent us scrambling for our equipment and escape route. From somewhere beneath the chamber floor came the unmistakable sound of movement, something large displacing massive amounts of rock and earth, accompanied by breathing that was too deep and too slow to come from any known animal. The sound suggested intelligence and intent, as if something ancient and powerful had been awakened by our presence and was now actively aware of our location. Our retreat from the chamber was disorganized and panicked, guided only by our rope markers and the Morrison brothers' knowledge of the cave system. The passages that had seemed stable during our entry now showed signs of structural instability. Loose rocks falling from the ceiling, new cracks appearing in the walls, and sections of floor that felt unsteady underfoot. The entire cave system seemed to be responding to whatever we had encountered in the deep chamber, as if the underground environment itself was rejecting our presence. We reached the surface after what felt like hours of desperate climbing and crawling, emerging into daylight to find that the cave entrance had partially collapsed behind us. Fresh rockfall blocked most of the opening, and new cracks in the surrounding cliff face suggested ongoing geological instability that posed a serious danger to anyone attempting to re-enter the system. The Morrison brothers reported that the landscape around the entrance looked different. Trees in slightly different positions, rock formations that did not match their memory of the area. Back at our field station, we attempted to review the data and documentation we had collected during the expedition. What we discovered was both scientifically frustrating and deeply unsettling. All of our digital recordings from the deep chamber were corrupted. The audio files contained nothing but static. The photographs showed only darkness, and our measurement data had been replaced by strings of symbols that matched the carvings we had seen on the cave wall. The corruption was selective, affecting only the files related to our encounter with the chanting voices and glowing symbols. The official USGS report classified the expedition as incomplete due to equipment failure and unstable cave conditions. The Ravens Hollow system was marked as potentially dangerous and removed from future survey schedules. Our team was reassigned to different projects, and we were individually briefed on the importance of maintaining scientific credibility by not discussing unsubstantiated phenomena that could not be verified through proper documentation and peer review. I returned to my regular duties, mapping cave systems throughout the southeastern United States. But the experience at Ravens Hollow fundamentally changed my understanding of what might exist in the unexplored spaces beneath the Appalachian Mountains. The geological formations in this region are among the oldest on Earth, predating not only human civilization, but most complex life forms. The caves carved through this ancient bedrock provide access to environments that have remained unchanged for millions of years, and it is possible that some of these spaces harbor forms of intelligence that developed along completely different evolutionary paths. Dr. Chen left geological survey work entirely, taking a position with a private environmental consulting firm that keeps him above ground and away from cave systems. Sarah Kim has continued her career in scientific photography, but refuses assignments involving underground documentation. The Morrison brothers know longer guide expeditions into unfamiliar cave systems, limiting their services to well-mapped and frequently visited locations where they can be certain of what clients might encounter. I have maintained my career in geological survey work, but I find myself approaching cave exploration with a heightened awareness of acoustic anomalies and unexplained phenomena. The scientific method demands that we distinguish between observable facts and subjective experiences, but it does not require us to ignore evidence simply because it challenges our current understanding of natural processes. The Appalachian Mountains contain cave systems that remain completely unexplored, and some of those dark spaces may harbor secrets that geological science is not yet equipped to understand. Sometimes, when I am working alone in deep cave systems, I listen carefully to the ambient sounds around me. Most underground acoustics can be explained by air currents, water flow, and the settling of rock formations. But occasionally, in the deepest and most isolated chambers, I hear echoes of that rhythmic chanting from Ravens Hollow, faint and distant, but unmistakably similar to what our team encountered in the glowing chamber 200 feet beneath the Kentucky forest. And when I hear those sounds, I pack my equipment and return to the surface, knowing that some discoveries are better left undisturbed in the ancient darkness where they have waited for millions of years. My name is Tommy Lee Jackson, and I have spent the better part of 30 years researching and documenting the forgotten settlements scattered throughout the Appalachian Mountains. As a local historian working on my third book about vanished communities in eastern Tennessee, I had heard whispers about Copper Creek, a settlement that supposedly disappeared overnight in 1923, leaving behind nothing but empty cabins and unanswered questions. The story had all the elements that drew me to these mountain mysteries: conflicting accounts, missing records, and local families who refused to discuss what their grandparents might have witnessed. The legend of Copper Creek first came to my attention through an elderly woman named Beulah Morrison, whose great-grandmother had lived in a neighboring hollow during the 1920s. According to family stories passed down through 4 generations, Copper Creek had been a thriving community of about 40 families who made their living through small-scale farming and seasonal work in the timber industry. The settlement sat in a narrow valley, accessible only by a single wagon road that wound through thick forest for nearly 8 miles before reaching the nearest established town. What made Copper Creek different from other remote mountain communities was the sudden and complete nature of its abandonment. According to Beulah's family stories, the settlement had been operating normally through the summer of 1923, with children attending the one-room schoolhouse and families preparing for the autumn harvest. Then, sometime in early September, every resident of Copper Creek simply vanished. No bodies were ever found, no belongings were packed, and no explanations were offered by surviving family members who lived in other parts of the county. The official records from that period were frustratingly incomplete. The county courthouse had no documentation of any investigation into the disappearances, and the local newspaper from 1923 contained no mention of missing persons or abandoned settlements. It was as if Copper Creek had been deliberately erased from historical memory by people who had compelling reasons to avoid discussing what had happened there. This type of systematic silence was unusual even for remote mountain communities that typically kept their business private from outside authorities. My research into Copper Creek began in earnest during the spring of 2018 when I finally located the approximate site of the settlement using property records from the early 1900s and topographical maps that showed the old wagon road. The area was now part of the Cherokee National Forest, accessed through a series of hiking trails that bore no resemblance to the original route used by the settlement's residents. I planned a 3-day camping trip to survey the site and document any remaining structures or artifacts that might shed light on what had happened to the community. The hike to the Copper Creek site took most of a day, following game trails and compass bearings through dense forest that showed no signs of recent human activity. The landscape was typical for that elevation and aspect: mixed hardwoods with thick understory, steep-sided ridges, and numerous small streams that would have provided adequate water for a farming community. As I approached the area marked on my maps as the settlement location, I began to notice subtle signs that the forest had not always been wild. Stone foundations barely visible under decades of leaf litter, fruit trees growing in patterns too regular to be natural, and sections of cleared land that were slowly being reclaimed by native vegetation. The settlement site itself was both more and less than I had expected. More because the remaining foundations suggested a larger and more established community than the fragmentary records had indicated. I counted at least 15 house sites, plus what appeared to be a school building, a church, and several barns or storage structures. Less because the systematic removal of all building materials meant that nothing remained above ground level except stone foundations and the occasional metal artifact weathered beyond recognition. What struck me immediately was the unnatural silence of the place. Even in remote forest locations, there are usually sounds of birds, insects, small animals moving through the underbrush, and wind rustling through the trees. But the Copper Creek site existed in a pocket of absolute quiet that felt oppressive and wrong. The silence was so complete that my own footsteps and breathing seemed unnaturally loud, and I found myself moving with excessive caution to avoid disturbing whatever had created this acoustic dead zone. I set up my base camp near what appeared to have been the center of the settlement, close to the foundation of the largest building. As evening approached, I began the systematic process of photographing and measuring the remaining structures, creating detailed maps that would allow me to understand the layout and size of the community. The work was absorbing and productive, exactly the kind of field research that formed the foundation of my historical documentation projects. That productive atmosphere changed dramatically as darkness fell. The oppressive silence that had characterized the daytime hours was gradually replaced by sounds that had no place in a remote forest location. I first noticed them around 9 o'clock, distant voices that seemed to be coming from various directions around the settlement site. The voices were too faint to understand clearly, but they had the rhythm and tone of normal conversation, as if people were going about their evening activities in houses that no longer existed. As the night progressed, the phantom sounds became more distinct and varied. I could hear children playing games that involved running and laughing, adults calling to each other across what would have been the settlement's main street, and the kind of domestic noises that characterize any active community. Doors closing, tools being used, animals being tended. Most unsettling was the sound of music drifting from the direction of what had been the church foundation. Hymns sung in harmony by voices that ranged from children to elderly adults. I tried to rationalize these experiences as auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation and imagination, but the sounds were too specific and consistent to dismiss as psychological phenomena. They followed patterns that made sense for a functioning community. Children's voices fading as bedtime approached. Adult conversations tapering off as the evening grew later. And a general settling into nighttime quiet that would have been normal for a rural settlement in the 1920s. Around midnight, the nature of the phantom sounds changed in a way that made rational explanation impossible. Instead of the domestic noises of evening activities, I began to hear what could only be described as sounds of distress and panic. Voices called out in fear, children cried, and adults shouted warnings and instructions in tones that suggested imminent danger. The sounds built to a crescendo of terror that lasted perhaps 10 minutes before cutting off abruptly, leaving behind the same oppressive silence that had characterized the daytime hours. In the sudden quiet that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the sound of children singing. Not the hymns I had heard earlier, but a simple children's song, with the kind of melody that might be taught in a one-room schoolhouse. The voices were clear and pure, sung in perfect harmony by what sounded like a dozen or more young singers. But the song itself was wrong. The melody was familiar, but the words were in no language I recognized, and the rhythm had a hypnotic quality that made it difficult to stop listening. The singing continued for nearly an hour, with the invisible children performing song after song in their mysterious language. As they sang, I began to see faint lights moving around the settlement site, pale, flickering illumination that looked like candlelight, or oil lamps being carried from building to building. The lights moved with purpose and intelligence, following paths that would have connected the various structures when the settlement was active. Most disturbing was my growing certainty that the lights were aware of my presence and were deliberately avoiding the area where I had made camp. I sat awake for the remainder of the night, watching the lights and listening to the singing while trying to document everything I was experiencing. My camera equipment functioned normally for photographing the stone foundations and daytime artifacts, but every attempt to record the phantom lights or singing resulted in completely blank images and silent audio files. The phenomena I was witnessing existed in some realm that electronic equipment could not detect or record. Dawn brought an end to the supernatural activity, but it also revealed evidence that made the previous night's experiences impossible to dismiss as imagination. Scattered around the settlement site were fresh wildflowers that had not been there the previous day, small bouquets placed on each foundation as if someone had been decorating graves or memorial sites. The flowers were native varieties that would have bloomed in the area during September, but it was currently May, months before their natural flowering season. More disturbing was the discovery of children's toys made from materials that dated to the early 1900s, carved wooden figures, cloth dolls, and simple games crafted from scraps of metal and wire. The toys were weathered and aged, but they had been placed in locations around the settlement site with obvious care and intention. Some sat on windowsills of foundations that no longer had walls, while others were arranged in playgroups as if children had just set them down temporarily. I spent the second day conducting a more thorough archaeological survey of the site, using metal detectors and careful excavation techniques to uncover additional artifacts from the original settlement. What I found confirmed that Copper Creek had been a substantial and well-established community that had ceased functioning abruptly rather than gradually declining. Personal belongings remained buried in what had been yards and gardens. Tools, dishes, clothing, and household items that families would never have abandoned voluntarily. The second night brought a repeat of the previous evening's supernatural activity, but with variations that suggested intelligence and intention behind the phenomena. The phantom voices seemed to be telling stories, with individual speakers taking turns in what sounded like a community gathering. I could not understand the language, but the rhythm and tone clearly indicated narrative storytelling of the type that would have been common entertainment in isolated mountain communities before radio and television. The children singing returned as well, but this time they performed songs that were recognizably familiar, hymns and folk ballads that would have been known throughout Appalachian communities in the 1920s. However, the words were still in that unknown language, as if the songs had been translated into something older than English. The singing was accompanied by the phantom lights, which moved in patterns that suggested dancing or some form of ceremonial activity centered around the church foundation. Most significantly, on the second night, I began to see actual figures moving among the lights. They were transparent and indistinct, visible only when I was not looking directly at them, but clearly human in form and behavior. I could see adults in period clothing going about activities that would have been normal for a mountain settlement, tending gardens, repairing tools, and gathering in small groups for conversation. Children played games that involved running and hiding, their laughter echoing across the site with supernatural clarity. The experience that finally convinced me to abandon the site occurred just before dawn on the third day. I was awakened by the sound of someone calling my name, not my full name, but the childhood nickname that only my immediate family had ever used. The voice was that of a young girl, perhaps 8 or 10 years old, speaking with the accent and inflection typical of mountain communities from the 1920s. She called my name repeatedly, each time from a different location around the settlement site, as if she was looking for me and expected me to respond. When I finally worked up the courage to call back, asking who was there and what she wanted, the response was immediate and terrifying. Every phantom voice on the site began calling my childhood nickname in unison. Men, women, and children all speaking together in a chorus that built to overwhelming volume before suddenly stopping. In the silence that followed, the young girl's voice spoke clearly from just outside my tent. "We have been waiting for someone to remember us. Will you tell our story?" I packed my equipment and left the Copper Creek site that morning, hiking out through the forest, with the sensation that I was being watched and followed by invisible companions who wished me no harm, but wanted desperately to be acknowledged. The sounds of the phantom community faded gradually as I put distance between myself and the settlement location, but I could hear the children singing until I was nearly back to the main hiking trail. My subsequent research into the Copper Creek disappearance has uncovered fragmentary evidence that something traumatic occurred at the settlement in September 1923, but the exact nature of the event remains mysterious. Local families who might have knowledge of what happened continue to avoid discussing the subject, and official records from that period show gaps that suggest deliberate concealment rather than accidental loss. What I can say with certainty is that the site of the former Copper Creek settlement remains active with supernatural phenomena that appear to be the residual presence of the community that vanished nearly a century ago. The experience has convinced me that some tragedies leave impressions on the landscape that persist long after the physical evidence has disappeared, and that the mountains of Appalachia harbor memories of events that conventional history has forgotten or chosen to ignore. I have never returned to the Copper Creek site, but I have kept the promise I made to the young girl whose voice called my name in the darkness. This account represents my attempt to tell their story and ensure that the vanished community is remembered, even if the truth of what happened to them remains lost in the shadows of Appalachian history. My name is Maria Santos, and I am a botanist specializing in endangered plant species native to the southeastern United States. In June of 2020, I was conducting field research in North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest as part of a grant project to document rare wildflowers that might be threatened by climate change and habitat loss. The work required me to venture into some of the most remote and inaccessible areas of the forest, including the dense thickets of mountain laurel that locals call laurel hells, impenetrable tangles of woody shrubs that can trap unwary hikers for hours or even days. I had been warned about laurel hells by other researchers who worked in Appalachian forests. The mountain laurel grows in such thick, intertwined masses that it creates natural barriers almost impossible to navigate. The branches grow at shoulder height, forming a canopy overhead, while leaving just enough space underneath for a person to crawl through on hands and knees. Once inside a laurel hell, it becomes nearly impossible to maintain a sense of direction, and the uniform appearance of the twisted branches makes every location look identical to every other location. Despite these warnings, my research specifically required specimens from plants that grew within these laurel thickets, species that had adapted to the unique microclimate created by the dense shrub cover. I equipped myself with GPS devices, emergency beacons, and enough supplies for extended fieldwork in difficult terrain. My plan was to spend 3 days systematically exploring a laurel hell in a remote section of the forest, where aerial surveys had identified potential habitat for several rare wildflower species. The laurel hell I selected was located in a steep-sided ravine about 8 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. According to topographical maps, the thicket covered approximately 40 acres of mountainside, with the densest growth concentrated along a creek bed that provided the moisture necessary for such luxuriant vegetation. I established my base camp on a ridge above the ravine and spent the first morning photographing the overall structure of the thicket from various angles to help me navigate once I was inside. My first entry into the laurel hell went according to plan. I marked my entry point with bright orange flagging tape and began the slow process of crawling through the tunnel-like spaces between the twisted branches. The work was physically demanding and claustrophobic, but I quickly located several specimens of rare trillium species that justified the difficulty of accessing their habitat. I collected samples, recorded GPS coordinates, and photographed the plants in their natural setting before working my way back to the marked entry point. The second day of fieldwork took me deeper into the thicket, following the creek bed toward an area where satellite imagery suggested a small clearing might exist. The crawling became more difficult as the laurel grew denser, and I frequently had to backtrack when branches became too tightly interwoven to allow passage. The work was slow and methodical, but I was making steady progress toward my research objectives while maintaining careful attention to navigation and safety protocols. It was during the afternoon of the second day that I first encountered signs that something other than plants and small animals inhabited the laurel hell. I found what appeared to be a tunnel through the thicket that was too large and too straight to have been created by natural growth patterns. The tunnel was approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, with branches that had been systematically broken or bent aside to create a clear passage. The broken ends of the branches showed signs of recent damage, and some still oozed sap that had not yet hardened. More disturbing was the discovery of markings on some of the larger laurel trunks, deep scratches in the bark that formed regular patterns, unlike anything that would be created by animals or weather. The scratches were too high above ground level to have been made by bears or other large mammals, and they showed a deliberate arrangement that suggested intelligence behind their creation. Some of the patterns resembled symbols or primitive writing, though I could not identify their meaning or origin. As I followed the artificial tunnel deeper into the thicket, I began to notice an unusual odor that grew stronger with each turn. The smell was organic but unfamiliar, not the scent of decay or animal musk, but something that reminded me of wet stone mixed with an almost metallic tang that made my nose burn and my eyes water. The odor was so strong in some sections of the tunnel that I had to cover my face with my shirt to continue breathing comfortably. The tunnel eventually opened into a clearing that did not appear on any of my maps or satellite images. The space was roughly circular, about 30 feet in diameter, completely enclosed by laurel thicket but open to the sky above. What made this clearing extraordinary was not its existence, but what it contained. Structures that had no place in a remote Appalachian forest and certainly had not been created by any known animal or natural process. In the center of the clearing stood what could only be described as an altar, a flat stone slab supported by smaller rocks arranged in a deliberate pattern. The stone surface was stained with dark material that looked disturbingly like dried blood, and symbols similar to those I had found carved in the laurel bark were etched around the edges of the slab. Arranged in a circle around the altar were smaller stones, each carved with individual symbols that formed a pattern too complex to be coincidental. More unsettling were the objects scattered around the altar and throughout the clearing. I found animal bones that had been arranged in geometric patterns, skulls of various forest creatures placed at regular intervals around the perimeter, and what appeared to be crude tools made from sharpened stone and carved wood. Everything in the clearing showed signs of recent use, and some of the bone arrangements looked fresh enough to have been created within the past few days. As I was photographing these disturbing artifacts, I became aware that I was no longer alone in the clearing. Something was moving through the laurel thicket around the perimeter, something large enough to disturb the branches, but skilled enough to move without making the kind of noise that a bear or deer would create. The movement was deliberate and controlled, circling the clearing at a consistent distance while remaining hidden within the dense vegetation. The circling presence triggered every survival instinct developed through years of fieldwork in remote locations. I gathered my equipment as quickly and quietly as possible, but as I moved toward what I hoped was the tunnel entrance, I realized that whatever was stalking me had positioned itself between me and the exit route. The sounds of movement through the laurel had shifted to block my planned escape path, forcing me to consider alternative routes through sections of the thicket that would be much more difficult to navigate. That consideration became moot when the thing in the laurel hell decided to reveal itself. The branches on the far side of the clearing parted with a sound like breaking timber, and something emerged that belonged in no classification system I knew as a botanist or had encountered in any wildlife field guide. The creature was roughly humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at joints that suggested additional bones or cartilage beyond normal human anatomy. Its skin was pale and mottled, covered with what looked like bark-like growths that helped it blend with the laurel branches. Most disturbing were its eyes, large, dark, and completely focused on me, with an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient but utterly alien. The creature moved with fluid grace despite its apparent size, and every movement suggested predatory capability that I was completely unprepared to deal with. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds before my nerve broke entirely. I crashed through the nearest section of laurel thicket without regard for the tunnel system, breaking branches and tearing my clothes and skin in desperate panic to put distance between myself and whatever I had disturbed in that hidden clearing. The creature did not pursue me directly, but I could hear it moving through the laurel parallel to my escape route, pacing me as I struggled through the dense vegetation. My panicked flight through the laurel hell lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes. I emerged from the thicket at a location completely different from my planned exit point, disoriented and exhausted, with no clear idea of where I was relative to my base camp. My GPS devices had malfunctioned during the encounter, showing error messages or completely blank screens, and my emergency beacon was damaged beyond function, by the violent passage through the dense branches. I eventually found my base camp by following a compass bearing toward the ridgeline, but not before spending several hours lost in unfamiliar forest terrain. When I finally reached my tent and equipment, I discovered that my research materials from the previous 2 days had been disturbed. Photographs were blurred or showed strange distortions. GPS coordinates were corrupted, and plant specimens had withered despite being properly preserved in collection containers. The official report I filed with the Forest Service described my research as incomplete due to equipment failure and difficult terrain conditions. I made no mention of the artificial clearing, the ritual artifacts, or the creature that had driven me from the Laurel Hell in panic. Scientific credibility requires evidence that can be verified and replicated, and I had neither photographs nor physical proof of what I had encountered in that hidden space within the thicket. I completed my graduate research using data collected from other forest locations and eventually earned my doctorate in botanical sciences. My career has continued successfully, but I have never again conducted fieldwork that required extended time in dense vegetation where visibility is limited and escape routes are not clearly identified. The experience in the Laurel Hell taught me that some plant communities may harbor forms of life that exist outside our current understanding of forest ecosystems. Other researchers have reported similar encounters in Appalachian forests, glimpses of figures that move through dense vegetation with impossible stealth, evidence of intelligence behind arrangements of natural materials that serve no obvious ecological purpose, and areas within otherwise normal forest environments that create sensations of being watched by something that does not wish to be discovered. These reports are typically dismissed as misidentification of known animals or psychological effects of working alone in isolated locations. But the Appalachian Mountains contain thousands of acres of Laurel Hell that have never been systematically explored or mapped. These thickets provide perfect habitat for species that prefer to remain hidden from human observation, and the dense vegetation makes scientific study nearly impossible using conventional research methods. If something has adapted to life within these impenetrable plant communities, it could exist undetected for decades or centuries, while occasionally encountering humans who venture too far into its domain. Sometimes when I am working with mountain laurel specimens in my laboratory, I catch myself listening for sounds that might indicate movement within dense vegetation. The memory of those dark, intelligent eyes watching me from the laurel thicket remains vivid even years after the encounter, and I continue to wonder what other secrets might be hidden within the green hells that dot the mountainsides throughout Appalachian forests. Some questions may be better left unanswered, and some thickets may be better left unexplored by researchers who are not prepared to discover that they are not alone in the wilderness they thought they understood. I'm Captain David Mitchell, United States Army, retired after 25 years of service in various capacities, including combat operations, training exercises, and special reconnaissance missions. My military experience taught me to observe details accurately, assess threats objectively, and maintain composure in situations that would panic civilian personnel. That training proved inadequate when confronted with phenomena that challenged every principle of physics and military doctrine I had learned during my career. In September of 2019, I was leading a survival training exercise for new recruits near Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina's Blue Ridge. The exercise was designed to test the soldiers' ability to navigate unfamiliar terrain at night, establish communications with base stations, and demonstrate basic survival skills under realistic field conditions. We had selected an area of rugged wilderness that provided appropriate challenges without exposing the trainees to genuine danger from wildlife or extreme weather conditions. My team consisted of 12 recruits fresh from basic training, 2 junior officers serving as assistant instructors, and myself as the primary training officer. We established our base camp at approximately 4,500 feet elevation on the eastern slope of Grandfather Mountain, positioned to provide clear lines of sight for radio communications, while remaining hidden from casual observation by civilian hikers or campers who might be in the area during the scheduled training period. The first 2 days of the exercise proceeded according to plan. The recruits demonstrated acceptable proficiency in basic skills like fire building, shelter construction, and orienteering using compass and map rather than GPS technology. We conducted night navigation exercises that required the soldiers to move between designated checkpoints using only starlight and minimal artificial illumination. The mountain terrain was challenging, but well within the capabilities of properly trained personnel. On the evening of our 3rd day in the field, we were conducting a communication exercise that required the recruits to establish radio contact with stations positioned at various elevations around the mountain. The conditions were ideal for radio operations: clear skies, minimal atmospheric interference, and good visibility that would allow visual confirmation of signal reception. I was monitoring multiple frequencies while the soldiers practiced proper radio protocol and signal procedures. At approximately 21:30 hours, our radio communications were interrupted by interference, unlike anything in my experience with military communications equipment. The static was structured and rhythmic, almost musical in its complexity, and it seemed to be coming from a source much more powerful than any of our portable radios. The interference was strong enough to override our transmissions completely, making normal communication impossible despite our equipment being in perfect working order. As I was adjusting radio settings to try to clear the interference, Sergeant Williams called my attention to unusual lights visible through the trees to our northwest. What I initially assumed to be aircraft navigation lights quickly revealed characteristics that eliminated any conventional explanation. The lights were too bright, too large, and moving in patterns that violated every principle of aerodynamics and physics that governed normal aircraft operation. There were 5 distinct light sources, each approximately the size and brightness of a full moon, arranged in a perfect geometric formation that maintained consistent spacing while maneuvering through 3-dimensional space. The lights changed position with sudden acceleration and instantaneous directional changes that would have created gravitational forces sufficient to kill any human occupants. Most disturbing was the complete absence of sound from objects that should have been creating tremendous noise if they were conventional aircraft. I immediately ordered the troops to maintain discipline and observe the phenomena without breaking cover or compromising our position. My military training emphasized the importance of gathering accurate intelligence about unknown contacts, and I wanted detailed observations from multiple witnesses before deciding on appropriate response procedures. The lights provided an excellent opportunity to test the soldiers' ability to maintain composure and follow orders during unexpected situations. The light formation moved across our field of view for approximately 15 minutes, performing maneuvers that demonstrated control and intelligence behind their operation. The objects accelerated from stationary positions to tremendous speeds, made 90-degree turns without slowing, and maintained perfect formation discipline that suggested either remote coordination or individual intelligence, sophisticated enough to respond instantly to changing flight patterns. Most significantly, the lights seemed to be conducting some form of systematic search or survey of the mountainside. They moved in overlapping search patterns that covered specific areas with methodical precision, pausing at certain locations for extended observation periods before moving to adjacent areas. The search pattern was too organized and purposeful to be random, and it appeared to be conducted by entities with specific objectives and detailed knowledge of the terrain. During one of their stationary observation periods, the light formation positioned itself directly above our camp location. The intensity of illumination was sufficient to read printed materials by Yet none of our electronic equipment registered any electromagnetic effects that should have accompanied such powerful light sources. The lights maintained their position for approximately 3 minutes, during which time I had the distinct impression that our unit was being studied and cataloged by whoever or whatever controlled the unknown objects. The psychological effect on the recruits was immediate and significant. Despite their military training and my orders to maintain position and discipline, several soldiers showed signs of panic that required direct intervention to prevent them from abandoning their posts. The lights created an atmosphere of vulnerability and helplessness that challenged the confidence and sense of control that military training is designed to develop in combat personnel. When the lights resumed their search pattern and moved away from our position, I made the decision to attempt radio contact with whatever intelligence might be controlling them. Using standard military protocols for communication with unknown contacts, I transmitted identification codes and requests for the objects to identify themselves and state their intentions. The response was immediate but incomprehensible. A complex series of tones and frequencies that sounded almost like language but followed no recognizable pattern of human communication. The communication attempts seemed to trigger a change in the lights' behavior. Instead of continuing their systematic search of the mountainside, they converged into a tight formation and began moving directly toward our position with obvious intent. The approach was neither aggressive nor friendly, but clearly purposeful in a way that suggested intelligence behind the decision to investigate our radio transmission. As the lights approached to within approximately 200 meters of our camp, I could see that they were not simply sources of illumination, but objects with definite structure and substance. Each light appeared to be attached to or emanating from a dark metallic object roughly triangular in shape and much larger than any conventional aircraft. The objects moved with complete silence and showed no visible means of propulsion, yet demonstrated flight capabilities that exceeded any known technology. At close range, the objects created effects that went beyond simple visual phenomena. The air temperature dropped noticeably, our compass needles began spinning randomly, and several soldiers reported feeling disoriented and nauseous. Most disturbing was the effect on our timepieces. Watches and chronometers that had been synchronized at the beginning of the exercise were now showing different times, as if each person had experienced the passage of time at a different rate. The close encounter lasted approximately 10 minutes before the objects departed as suddenly as they had approached. They accelerated vertically at tremendous speed, disappearing into the night sky without any visible exhaust trail or evidence of conventional propulsion systems. The departure was followed by a return to normal environmental conditions and the restoration of radio communications that had been interrupted throughout the encounter. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, I was faced with the challenge of maintaining unit discipline and morale while dealing with phenomena that fell completely outside normal military procedures and protocols. The soldiers had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of reality, and several requested permission to report the incident to family members or civilian authorities. I reminded them of their security obligations and the importance of following proper military channels for reporting unusual incidents. The official after-action report classified the incident as equipment malfunction combined with misidentification of civilian aircraft conducting authorized flight operations in the area. The radio interference was attributed to atmospheric conditions, and the visual sightings were explained as confusion caused by reflection of ground lights off low cloud formations. The report recommended additional training in equipment troubleshooting and aircraft identification to prevent similar incidents in future exercises. None of the soldiers under my command were ever reassigned to missions involving sensitive or classified operations. Their military careers progressed normally, but they were systematically excluded from duties that required security clearances or involved classified information. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, suggesting that the incident had been noted by higher authorities and resulted in permanent restrictions on their access to sensitive military information. I completed my military career without ever again encountering phenomena similar to what we observed over Grandfather Mountain. However, the experience fundamentally changed my understanding of what might exist beyond current military and scientific knowledge. The objects we encountered demonstrated technology and capabilities that exceeded anything in known military arsenals, and their behavior suggested intelligence and purpose behind their activities in Appalachian airspace. Retirement has allowed me to research similar incidents reported by civilian witnesses throughout the Appalachian region. The accounts are remarkably consistent in describing structured objects with advanced propulsion systems, intelligent flight patterns, and effects on electronic equipment and human physiology. The frequency of such reports suggests that whatever we encountered that night continues to operate in the mountains, with objectives that remain unknown to civilian and military authorities. The Appalachian Mountains provide ideal conditions for undetected aerial operations. Vast wilderness areas with minimal population, complex terrain that interferes with radar systems, and a cultural tradition of respecting privacy that discourages detailed investigation of unusual phenomena. If advanced technology is being tested or deployed in these mountains, the isolation and geographical characteristics would provide excellent cover for operations that require concealment from public observation. My military experience taught me to distinguish between threats that require immediate response and mysteries that require patient observation and analysis. The lights over Grandfather Mountain represented something beyond current human technology, but they demonstrated no hostile intent toward military personnel conducting legitimate training exercises. Whatever intelligence controls those objects appears to have objectives that do not conflict with normal military operations, though their presence suggests capabilities that could pose significant strategic implications if their intentions were to change. My name is Amy Catherine Wheeler, though most people know me as Katie. I work as a social worker with the Appalachian Communities Trust, an organization dedicated to providing support services to isolated families throughout the mountain regions of Virginia, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. The work involves traveling to remote areas where traditional social services cannot reach, bringing medical supplies, educational materials, and connecting families with resources they need to improve their living conditions. In October of 2021, I was assigned to investigate reports of a family living in extreme isolation, somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains of southwestern Virginia. The case had been referred to our organization by a postal worker who claimed to have encountered children during his mail route who appeared malnourished and spoke in a dialect he could not understand. According to his report, the children had fled when he tried to approach them, disappearing into forest terrain too rough for his vehicle to follow. The postal worker had provided GPS coordinates for the general area where he encountered the children, but warned that no official roads led to their location. My supervisor equipped me with a four-wheel drive vehicle, emergency supplies, and communication equipment designed to work in areas with poor cell phone reception. The plan was to spend 3 days searching the area, make contact with the isolated family, and assess their need for social services intervention. The drive into the Blue Ridge backcountry took most of a day, following Forest Service roads that gradually deteriorated from paved surfaces to gravel to dirt tracks barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The deeper I penetrated into the mountains, the more obvious it became that this was territory rarely visited by outsiders. Posted signs warning about private property and prohibiting trespassing became more frequent, and several appeared to have been reinforced with additional warnings written in handwriting I could barely read. According to my GPS unit, I was approximately 2 miles from the coordinates provided by the postal worker when the Forest Service road simply ended. Beyond the turnaround area, a narrow footpath continued deeper into the mountains, marked by occasional strips of faded cloth tied to tree branches. The path was clearly maintained and regularly used, suggesting an established route to whatever community existed in the remote hollow ahead. I locked my vehicle and began hiking along the path, carrying a backpack with basic supplies and documentation materials. The trail was well defined but steep, winding through dense forest that blocked most sunlight and created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight. What struck me immediately was the unusual quiet of the forest. No bird songs, no insect noise, and no sound of wind moving through the trees. The silence was so complete that my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud despite my efforts to move quietly. After approximately 2 hours of steady hiking, the path crested a ridge and descended into a narrow valley that opened into what could only be described as a hidden community. Scattered throughout the hollow were structures that looked like they belonged to an earlier century. Log cabins with hand-split shingle roofs, outbuildings constructed from rough timber and fieldstone, and garden areas cleared from the forest using methods that left no evidence of modern machinery or tools. What made the scene disturbing rather than quaint was the apparent condition of the buildings and the complete absence of any people. The structures showed signs of recent habitation, smoke rising from chimneys, clothing hanging on lines, and gardens that had been recently tended, but no residents were visible despite obvious signs of current occupation. Most unsettling was a sense that I was being watched by invisible observers who were evaluating my presence and intentions. At the center of the community stood a building that was unmistakably a church, constructed in the simple architectural style typical of rural mountain congregations. Unlike the residential structures, the church showed signs of active maintenance and regular use. Fresh whitewash covered the exterior walls, the windows were clean and intact, and the heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar as if inviting visitors to enter. As I approached the church building, I could hear sounds from inside that suggested a service in progress. Voices singing hymns in harmony, the rhythm of responsive prayer, and what sounded like a sermon being delivered in the passionate style typical of fundamentalist mountain preachers. The sounds were clear and distinct, obviously coming from a congregation of considerable size, but when I peered through the partially open door, the interior of the church was completely empty. The disconnect between what I could hear and what I could see created a disorienting sense of reality distortion that challenged my ability to process sensory information objectively. I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside, hoping to find a rational explanation for the phantom sounds. The church interior was typical of rural mountain congregations: simple wooden pews arranged in rows, a raised pulpit at the front, and windows that would have provided adequate lighting during daytime services. But the building was unquestionably empty of people, despite the continued sounds of active worship that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The singing was beautiful and complex, performed by voices that ranged from children to elderly adults, all singing in perfect harmony with lyrics that I recognized as traditional hymns. The preaching was delivered with the kind of fervent intensity that characterized mountain revival traditions, though the words were occasionally in a dialect so thick I could not understand their meaning. As I stood in the empty church listening to the phantom congregation, I became aware that the service was not simply a recording or echo of past events. The worship was responsive to my presence. When I moved closer to the pulpit, the preaching became more intense and directed, as if the invisible minister was addressing me specifically. When I sat in one of the pews, the congregation's singing seemed to welcome my participation, creating harmonies that included a part for my voice, even though I remained silent. The realization that I was somehow interacting with intelligences that existed in the same space but were invisible to my eyes created a level of psychological stress that threatened my ability to maintain professional composure. My training as a social worker had not prepared me for encounters with phenomena that challenged basic assumptions about reality and sensory perception. The situation required me to continue my investigation, while acknowledging that normal rules of cause and effect might not apply. I remained in the church for approximately 30 minutes, listening to the invisible service and trying to understand what kind of community I had stumbled into. The worship followed patterns that would have been familiar to anyone acquainted with Appalachian religious traditions: opening hymns, responsive prayer, scriptural readings, passionate preaching, and closing songs. But the content occasionally included references that seemed to predate European settlement of the region, mentioning places and events that belonged to much older religious traditions. When I finally left the church and continued exploring the hollow, I discovered that the phantom community extended beyond the religious service. I could hear sounds of daily life coming from the various cabins: children playing, adults working, conversations between family members, and the domestic noises that characterize any active community. But every building I investigated was empty of visible inhabitants, furnished with period-appropriate items, but showing no signs of current human presence. The garden areas told a different story. The plots were clearly being maintained by someone with extensive knowledge of mountain agriculture, planted with heirloom varieties of vegetables and herbs that would have been common in Appalachian communities before the introduction of commercial farming. The plants were healthy and well-tended, showing evidence of recent watering and cultivation, but I never saw anyone working in the fields despite spending several hours exploring the community. Most disturbing was my growing certainty that the invisible residents were not simply going about their daily activities without regard for my presence. They seemed to be deliberately avoiding visual contact while remaining audibly active, as if they existed in a parallel version of the same physical space. Conversations would move to different buildings just ahead of my investigation route. Children's laughter would shift to areas I had not yet explored, and work activities would pause when I approached before resuming once I moved away. The psychological impact of spending hours in a community that I could hear but not see began to affect my judgment and decision-making abilities. The constant awareness of being surrounded by invisible observers created a level of stress that made it difficult to maintain the professional objectivity necessary for conducting a proper social services assessment. More concerning was the gradual realization that I was beginning to see faint, translucent figures moving at the edge of my peripheral vision, people who vanished the moment I tried to look directly at them. By evening, the phantom community had settled into what appeared to be their normal nighttime routine. The sounds of domestic activities diminished, children's voices faded as bedtime approached, and the general noise level decreased to the quiet typical of rural communities after dark. But the church service continued throughout the night, with the invisible congregation maintaining their worship through hymns, prayers, and preaching that suggested a religious intensity beyond normal denominational practices. I spent the night in my vehicle at the edge of the community, unable to bring myself to camp within the hollow, but unwilling to abandon my investigation without gathering more information about the isolated family I was supposed to be helping. Throughout the night, I could hear the ongoing church service and occasional sounds from the residential areas that suggested the community was active even during hours when most people would normally be asleep. Dawn brought no resolution to the mystery, but it did provide evidence that convinced me to terminate my investigation and return to report my findings to supervisory personnel. Fresh food had been placed on the hood of my vehicle overnight: mountain apples, wild berries, and what appeared to be fresh bread baked, using traditional methods. The items were clearly intended as gifts, arranged with obvious care and consideration for my welfare as a visitor to their community. More significantly, a handwritten note had been left with the food, written in English, but using spelling and grammar that suggested an educational background from much earlier historical periods. The message was simple but clear. We thank you for your kindness in coming to help our children, but we have no need of services from the outside world. Our community has provided for itself for many generations and will continue to do so with God's blessing. Please tell others that we wish to remain undisturbed in our worship and our traditional ways. The note was signed by someone identifying himself as Elder Samuel Morrison, pastor of the Holiness Church of the Sacred Hollow. Research conducted after my return to base headquarters revealed that a Samuel Morrison had indeed been a preacher in that general area of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but according to historical records, he had died in 1894. The community he served had been abandoned sometime in the early 1900s, when most mountain families moved to areas with better access to schools and employment opportunities. My official report to the Appalachian Communities Trust described the case as resolved, noting that no isolated family requiring social services intervention had been located in the specified area. I recommended that the case file be closed and that no further investigation be conducted unless additional credible reports were received from reliable sources. The recommendation was accepted without question, and I was reassigned to cases in different geographical areas. I have never returned to that hollow in the Blue Ridge Mountains, but I have continued to research the history of religious communities in remote Appalachian areas. The region has a long tradition of separatist religious groups that withdrew from mainstream society to practice their faith without outside interference. Some of these communities maintained their isolation for generations, developing unique customs and beliefs that reflected their interpretation of biblical teachings combined with older spiritual traditions. It is possible that some of these religious communities found ways to maintain their existence beyond the normal limits of human life, continuing their worship and traditional ways in forms that allow them to remain hidden from contemporary society, while occasionally revealing themselves to outsiders who approach their territory with respectful intentions. The Appalachian Mountains contain countless hollows and valleys where such communities might exist undetected, protected by terrain and tradition from the modern world that surrounds but cannot penetrate their sacred spaces. My name is Robert Kowalski, though everyone who follows my YouTube channel knows me as Bobby. I started exploring abandoned coal mines across Pennsylvania's coal country back in 2015, documenting forgotten places and their histories for my channel, Forgotten Underground. By 2019, I had built up a subscriber base of about 50,000 people who were fascinated by the industrial archaeology of America's mining heritage. Most of my explorations were routine: empty shafts, rusted equipment, and the occasional historical artifact left behind when operations shut down. The mine that changed everything was located near the town of Centralia in Columbia County, Pennsylvania. Centralia is famous for being mostly abandoned due to an underground coal fire that has been burning since 1962, but there are dozens of other mine sites in the area that were closed for economic rather than safety reasons. I had received a tip from a local historian about a mine entrance hidden in the woods about 3 miles from the main Centralia site, supposedly sealed in the 1930s, but recently reopened by vandals or urban explorers. I drove up to the area on a crisp October morning in 2019, equipped with my usual gear: multiple cameras, powerful LED lights, air quality monitors, and emergency communication equipment. The hike to the mine entrance took about an hour through dense forest that showed clear signs of the region's mining history. Old rail beds cut through the trees, foundations of company buildings dotted the landscape, and the occasional piece of rusted mining equipment lay half-buried in decades of fallen leaves. The mine entrance itself was exactly as described: a horizontal shaft cut into a hillside, about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, with rails still visible leading into the darkness. Someone had indeed broken through the concrete barrier that had sealed the entrance, leaving a hole large enough for a person to crawl through. Fresh graffiti around the entrance showed that other urban explorers had discovered the site, but the tags were old enough to suggest that I would be alone during my documentation visit. I spent about 30 minutes setting up my equipment and testing my air quality monitors before entering the mine. The readings were acceptable, no dangerous gases detected, oxygen levels within normal range, and no immediate structural hazards visible at the entrance. I activated my cameras and began the systematic exploration that my subscribers expected, narrating the history of the site while documenting the physical evidence of its industrial past. The main tunnel extended about 200 feet into the hillside before branching into multiple smaller shafts that had accessed different coal seams. Most of these side tunnels were partially collapsed or flooded, but several remained passable for someone willing to crawl through tight spaces. The mine showed typical signs of hasty abandonment, tools left where workers had dropped them, mining cars still on their rails, and personal items scattered throughout the tunnels. What made this mine different from others I had explored was the exceptional preservation of organic materials that normally would have decomposed decades earlier. I found newspapers from the 1930s that were still readable, wooden support timbers that showed no signs of rot, and even food containers that looked like they had been left the previous week rather than 80 years ago. The preservation was so complete that it felt like the mine existed in a bubble where time had stopped moving at normal speed. I was approximately 400 feet into the main tunnel system when I first heard the voices. They started as barely audible whispers that I initially attributed to air currents moving through the mine shafts, but gradually became recognizable as human conversation. The voices seemed to be coming from deeper in the mine, from passages that my lights had not yet illuminated. Most unsettling was the realization that the conversations were in a language I could partially understand, English spoken with the heavy accent and vocabulary typical of early 20th century coal miners. The voices were discussing work-related topics, shift assignments, equipment problems, and safety concerns that would have been typical of mining operations during the 1930s. I could hear individual speakers clearly enough to distinguish between different people, and the conversations had the natural rhythm and casual tone of workers going about their daily routines. But every tunnel and chamber I investigated was empty, with no signs of recent human presence beyond the graffiti near the entrance. As I moved deeper into the mine, the phantom conversations became more distinct and numerous. I could hear men calling to each other across different sections of the mine, discussing the coal seams they were working and the problems they were encountering. Some voices belonged to supervisors giving instructions, while others were clearly laborers responding to orders or chatting during break periods. The conversations were so realistic and detailed that I began checking my equipment to see if somehow I was picking up radio transmissions from contemporary mining operations. My electronic equipment was functioning normally, showing no unusual readings or interference that might explain the phantom voices. But as I continued exploring, the conversations began to include references that made it clear these were not contemporary miners. The workers discussed events from the 1930s as if they were current news, mentioned mining techniques that had been obsolete for decades, and used terminology that belonged to an earlier era of coal extraction. Most disturbing was my growing realization that the phantom miners seemed to be aware of my presence. When I paused to listen carefully, the conversations would shift to discussions about someone new in the tunnels and speculation about who I might be and what I was doing in their mine. The tone was not threatening, but rather curious and somewhat protective, as if the invisible workers were concerned about a stranger wandering through their workplace without proper supervision. I was documenting a section of tunnel that showed evidence of a partial collapse when one of the phantom voices addressed me directly. A man with a thick Pennsylvania German accent called out from somewhere deeper in the mine, asking if I needed help finding my way and warning me about dangerous areas where the roof structure was unstable. The voice was clear and distinct, obviously directed at me personally, but when I called back asking who was there, the only response was echoing silence. The direct communication from the invisible miners created a level of psychological stress that challenged my ability to continue the exploration professionally. I had built my reputation on objective documentation of abandoned sites, and my subscribers expected rational explanations for unusual phenomena rather than ghost stories and supernatural speculation. But the evidence of my own senses was impossible to dismiss as imagination or equipment malfunction. I continued deeper into the mine, driven by curiosity and the commitment to provide thorough documentation for my channel. The phantom conversations continued throughout my exploration, with the invisible workers maintaining their discussions about mining operations, safety procedures, and workplace concerns that reflected the realities of coal extraction during the 1930s. Occasionally, individual voices would call out warnings about unstable areas or suggestions for safer routes through sections of the mine that I had not yet explored. The climax of the experience came when I reached what appeared to be the deepest accessible section of the mine, a large chamber where multiple tunnels converged around what had been the main coal extraction area. The chamber showed evidence of intensive mining activity, deep cuts in the rock face, abandoned equipment, and support structures that indicated this had been a critical part of the operation when the mine was active. In this chamber, the phantom voices reached their maximum intensity and clarity. I could hear what sounded like an entire shift of miners going about their work. Men calling measurements to each other, equipment being operated, coal cars being loaded and moved along the rails. The sounds were so realistic and detailed that I found myself looking around the chamber expecting to see the workers, despite knowing that I was alone in an abandoned mine that had been closed for nearly a century. The invisible mining operation continued for approximately 20 minutes while I documented the chamber and its contents. During this time, I had the distinct impression that the phantom workers were performing a demonstration specifically for my benefit, showing me how the mine had operated during its active period and helping me understand the industrial processes that had taken place in these tunnels. The experience was educational rather than frightening, as if the spirits of former workers wanted their story to be told accurately. The phantom activity gradually diminished as I prepared to leave the chamber, but before the voices faded completely, the same Pennsylvania German accent that had spoken to me earlier called out a final message. The invisible miner thanked me for visiting their workplace and asked that I remember the men who had worked and died in these tunnels, reminding me that their labor had powered the industries and cities that built modern America. My exit from the mine was uneventful, but I found that my electronic equipment had recorded anomalies throughout the exploration. Video footage showed strange light patterns that were not visible to my eyes during the filming, and audio recordings contained sounds that did not match my memory of what I had heard in the tunnels. Most significant were sections of clear conversation that appeared on the recordings but were in voices different from the phantom miners I had heard during my exploration. When I reviewed the footage for editing, I discovered that my cameras had somehow documented the mine as it appeared during active operation, with electric lights, functioning equipment, and even brief glimpses of workers who were translucent but clearly visible on the recordings. The footage was extraordinary, showing details of mining operations that would have been historically valuable even if the paranormal elements were ignored. However, when I attempted to upload the material to my YouTube channel, every file containing the paranormal footage was corrupted during the transfer process. The historical documentation of the mine's physical structure uploaded normally, but all evidence of the phantom miners and their invisible operations was lost to technical failures that my computer specialists could not explain or resolve. The episode I eventually published about the mine exploration focused on its historical significance and industrial archaeology, with only brief mentions of unusual acoustics and unexplained sounds that I attributed to air currents and structural settling. My subscribers seemed satisfied with the content, but several commented that something seemed different about my presentation, as if I was holding back information or had been affected by the experience in ways that were not immediately obvious. I have continued exploring abandoned mines throughout Pennsylvania and surrounding states, but I have never again encountered phenomena comparable to what I experienced in that mine near Centralia. The incident taught me that some industrial sites may retain more than just physical evidence of their operational history, and that the human stories connected to these places may persist long after the last shift has ended and the entrances have been sealed. Coal mining was dangerous work that claimed thousands of lives throughout Pennsylvania's industrial history, and many miners died in accidents that were never properly investigated or memorialized. It is possible that some of these men remain connected to the tunnels where they spent their working lives, continuing their labor in forms that allow them to occasionally communicate with visitors who approach their workplace with respect and genuine interest in their story. The abandoned mines scattered throughout Pennsylvania's coal regions represent one of America's most significant industrial heritage resources, but they also serve as monuments to the workers whose labor and sacrifice built the foundation of modern industrial society. Sometimes, when exploring these sites, we may encounter more than just rusted equipment and empty tunnels. We may find that the human spirit of these places is as enduring as the stone and steel that housed their operations. My name is Jennifer Blackwood, though most people in the environmental movement know me simply as Jen. I have spent the last 15 years fighting to protect the remaining old-growth forest throughout the southeastern United States, working with various conservation organizations to document and preserve these ancient woodland communities before they are lost to logging or development. In the summer of 2022, I became involved in what should have been a straightforward conservation effort in Virginia's Jefferson National Forest, an effort that revealed something about old-growth forests that challenged everything I thought I knew about the relationship between humans and the natural world. The controversy began when a timber company received permits to conduct selective logging in a section of Jefferson National Forest that contained some of the oldest trees in Virginia. According to our research, several white oaks and tulip poplars in the area were over 400 years old, representing some of the last remnants of the forest that had covered these mountains before European settlement. The logging permits allowed for the removal of younger trees, while supposedly protecting the ancient giants. But our organization knew that selective logging often damaged or killed the very trees it was intended to preserve. I volunteered to conduct a civil disobedience action that would draw media attention to the threat facing these ancient trees. The plan was simple but dramatic. I would chain myself to the largest oak tree in the area and remain there until the logging permits were rescinded or at least suspended pending further environmental review. It was a tactic that had been successful in other forest protection campaigns, and I was prepared to spend several days or even weeks living in the forest if necessary to save trees that had been growing since before the founding of the United States. The tree I selected for my protest was a massive white oak located in a small clearing about 2 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. According to our measurements, the tree was approximately 420 years old, with a trunk diameter of nearly 8 feet and a canopy spread that covered almost an entire acre. It stood in the center of a grove of similarly ancient trees, creating a cathedral-like space where the forest canopy filtered sunlight into soft green illumination that gave the area an almost sacred atmosphere. I arrived at the site on a Monday morning in late June, carrying enough supplies to sustain myself for at least a week. My support team helped me establish a base camp and secured the chain around both my waist and the massive trunk of the ancient oak. Once the media was notified and the first news crews arrived to document the protest, my supporters withdrew to a respectful distance, leaving me alone with the tree that I had committed to protect with my physical presence. The first day and night of the protest went exactly as expected. I gave interviews to reporters explained the environmental significance of old-growth forests, and settled into the routine of living outdoors in close physical contact with a tree that had been alive since the early 1600s. The experience was peaceful and inspiring, exactly the kind of connection with nature that had motivated my career in environmental activism. I felt honored to be serving as a guardian for such an ancient and magnificent living being. The second day brought the first signs that my protest was having an impact beyond simple media attention. Logging company representatives arrived to assess the situation, followed by Forest Service personnel who needed to determine how to respond to my action without creating a public relations disaster. I maintained my position chained to the oak tree while various officials discussed legal options and safety protocols for removing me from the site, without causing harm to either myself or the ancient trees I was trying to protect. It was during the second night, alone in the forest, with only the sounds of nocturnal wildlife for company, that I began to notice phenomena that transformed my understanding of what it meant to be in the presence of truly ancient trees. As darkness settled over the forest, the grove of old-growth trees seemed to become more active in ways that had nothing to do with wind or the normal settling sounds that all forests make during temperature changes. I could hear what sounded like whispered conversations coming from the trees themselves, soft, rustling communications that had the rhythm and pattern of language but used sounds that no human vocal apparatus could produce. The conversations seemed to involve the entire grove, with individual trees contributing to discussions that flowed from one ancient giant to another in patterns that suggested complex social interaction among beings that most people considered to be simply large plants. More unsettling was my growing awareness that the trees were discussing my presence in their grove. While I could not understand the specific content of their communications, the rhythm and tone clearly indicated that they were evaluating my intentions and deciding how to respond to the unusual situation of having a human physically attached to one of their community members for an extended period. The conversations had an ancient quality that suggested these trees had been communicating with each other for centuries, developing relationships and shared knowledge that far exceeded anything in human experience. As the night progressed, I began to feel physical sensations that seemed to originate from the oak tree to which I was chained. Gentle vibrations traveled through the trunk, creating patterns that felt almost like a slow, massive heartbeat. The bark against my back grew warm despite the cool night air, and I had the distinct impression that the tree was somehow adjusting its temperature to keep me comfortable during my vigil. Most remarkably, I started to experience what could only be described as shared memories, images and sensations that seemed to come from the oak tree's 4 centuries of existence in this forest. I saw the grove as it had appeared during different historical periods, with the surrounding landscape changing as Native American settlements gave way to European colonization, as logging roads cut through the forest, and as the trees gradually became isolated remnants of a much larger woodland community that had once covered the entire mountain range. The shared memories included encounters with humans throughout the centuries, Native Americans who had recognized the grove as a sacred site and visited regularly for ceremonial purposes, early European settlers who had marked certain trees for future cutting but never returned to harvest them, and more recent visitors who had camped beneath the ancient canopy or simply stopped to rest in the cathedral-like space created by the towering trees. Most disturbing were memories of other trees that had once been part of the grove but had been cut down over the years. I could feel the oak tree's grief for lost companions, ancient beings that had shared centuries of growth and communication before being reduced to stumps and lumber. The emotional weight of these losses was overwhelming, creating a sense of survivor guilt and profound loneliness that helped me understand why the remaining trees had developed such intense bonds with each other. On the third night of my protest, The grove revealed capabilities that went far beyond simple communication and shared memory. As I sat chained to the ancient oak, I watched in amazement as the trees began to actively defend themselves and their human guardian from perceived threats. When a black bear wandered into the clearing, attracted by the scent of my food supplies, several smaller trees moved their branches to create barriers that discouraged the animal from approaching too closely to my location. The movement of the branches was too coordinated and purposeful to be explained by wind or natural growth patterns. Individual trees were clearly responding to some form of shared intelligence that allowed the grove to act collectively in response to immediate situations. The bear seemed to recognize that it was not welcome in the grove and departed without attempting to investigate my campsite further. More impressive was the grove's response to the arrival of logging equipment on the 4th day of my protest. As chainsaws and heavy machinery approached along the Forest Service road, the trees began creating obstacles that made access to the grove increasingly difficult. Branches fell across the road in patterns that appeared natural but effectively blocked vehicle access. Roots emerged from the ground to create trip hazards for workers on foot, and thick undergrowth suddenly appeared in areas that had been clear the previous day. The logging crews attributed these obstacles to normal forest conditions and spent considerable time clearing paths and removing barriers that the trees seemed to be creating faster than human workers could eliminate them. The Forest Service personnel supervising the operation became increasingly frustrated with delays and complications that made the selective logging much more difficult and expensive than originally planned. Meanwhile, my physical connection to the ancient oak tree was creating changes in my own perception and consciousness that challenged my understanding of the boundary between human awareness and plant intelligence. I found myself thinking in patterns that seemed to reflect tree time rather than human time, developing patience and perspective that allowed me to perceive changes and relationships that normally occurred too slowly for human consciousness to detect. Most significantly, I began to understand that my protest was serving a purpose beyond simple media attention or political pressure. The grove had been waiting for a human ally who could bridge the communication gap between tree consciousness and human society, someone who could speak for the ancient forest community in terms that other humans might understand and respect. The realization came with a sense of profound responsibility that extended far beyond my original environmental activism goals. I was not simply protecting individual trees from logging. I was serving as an ambassador between two forms of consciousness that had coexisted on this planet for millions of years, but had rarely achieved direct communication and mutual understanding. On the 5th day of my protest, the logging permits were officially suspended, pending further environmental review, and I was legally free to unlock the chain and leave the grove. But my experience with the ancient trees had created a commitment that went beyond the immediate political victory. I had become part of a relationship that could not be easily abandoned, connected to a community of ancient beings who had shared their memories, their communications, and their trust with a human who had been willing to risk her freedom to protect their lives. I remained chained to the oak tree for 2 additional days, using the time to document my experiences and develop plans for long-term protection of the grove that would go beyond temporary legal victories. When I finally unlocked the chain and prepared to leave, I felt the oak tree's acknowledgement and gratitude in the form of vibrations and warmth that clearly conveyed emotional content despite the absence of human language. The grove's protection campaign ultimately succeeded, with the old growth area receiving permanent preservation status that prohibits any form of logging or development. But my personal involvement with the ancient trees continues through regular visits and an ongoing commitment to serve as their advocate in human society. I have learned that some forests contain communities of consciousness that have been developing for centuries, and that these ancient beings may have wisdom and perspectives that human civilization desperately needs as we face environmental challenges that threaten the survival of both species. The experience taught me that environmental activism is not simply about protecting resources for human use, but about recognizing and respecting forms of intelligence and community that exist throughout the natural world. The old-growth forests of Appalachia may harbor secrets that are far older and more complex than anything in human history, and some of those secrets may be willing to share their knowledge with humans who approach them with appropriate respect and commitment. Sometimes, when I visit other old-growth forests, I find myself listening for the whispered conversations between ancient trees and watching for signs of the collective intelligence that governs these woodland communities. The memory of those 5 days chained to the oak tree remains vivid, reminding me that the natural world contains forms of consciousness that we are only beginning to understand, and that some of those consciousnesses may be actively seeking ways to communicate with humans who are willing to listen.